They say some letters take their time getting where they're meant to go. Sometimes years, sometimes decades, and sometimes they land where they weren't supposed to, but somehow still reach the person who needs to read them most. Back in 2006, Ellen Rhodes was 54. She lived alone in a red brick house just outside of Burlington, Vermont, where the shutters always needed painting, and the mailbox leaned slightly to the left. She worked part-time at a local bookstore and spent the rest of her time walking the same loop around the lake she'd walked for 20 years. People in the neighborhood said she was polite but private, not unfriendly, just always a little distant, like her thoughts were often somewhere else. It had been 15 years since her husband died. They hadn't had children, and her family lived far away. She had friends, yes, and she met them for lunch on Sundays. But there was a quietness in her life that even she didn't fully acknowledge. She'd built it that way, deliberately, carefully. Days were gentle, predictable. She had found comfort in the small rituals of solitude. One afternoon in late November, Ellen found a letter in her mailbox. The envelope was yellowed and worn, with a faded stamp and smudged postmark. Her name was written in neat, looping cursive, and underneath her address. But the house number was wrong by 1 digit. That house had been torn down 2 years ago. She almost tossed it aside, assuming it was some misplaced Christmas card. But something about the handwriting made her pause. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. The letter began simply, addressing her by name, her maiden name. The tone was soft, hesitant, full of the kind of vulnerability people usually save for journal entries or late-night phone calls. It was signed only with an initial, C. She read it 3 times before she realized who had written it. Christopher Lane. They had met in 1978. She had been 26, newly hired as a librarian at the university. He was 30, a visiting lecturer with a grin that made people nervous and a voice that made them stay. Their connection had been instant, undeniable, and, at the time, deeply inconvenient. He was married. She was engaged. They never had an affair. Not in the way people think. But they saw each other every Wednesday at the same cafe, sat at the same table, shared stories and silences that became more intimate than either of them could explain. For 7 months, their lives ran parallel, full of everything that almost was. There was a comfort in the way they simply existed in the same moment, suspended between duty and desire. Then one day he stopped showing up. No note, no call, nothing. She waited for 3 Wednesdays, then stopped going. Eventually she married her fiancé, the same man who later died of a heart attack in their kitchen while reaching for the kettle. She hadn't thought of Christopher Lane in years. And now this letter, dated 1980, postmarked from New York. It had been lost, misrouted, then rerouted. A 30-word note that should have arrived 26 years earlier. In it he wrote that he was leaving his wife, that he'd accepted a job overseas, that he didn't know if Ellen still thought of him, but he thought of her every day, that he didn't want to go without telling her she had mattered. The address he'd written was close, 1 digit off, enough for the letter to vanish into the system. She spent that night staring at the ceiling, not crying and not exactly, but caught in the strange space between nostalgia and mourning, not for what had happened, but for what hadn't, for all the versions of herself that never got the chance to become real. The next day, she searched his name online. It didn't take long to find him. He was living in a coastal town in Maine, retired. A short article about his photography exhibit at the local library confirmed it was the same man. The eyes hadn't changed. She debated for 3 weeks. Then, just before Christmas, she sent a card. Nothing dramatic. Just a note saying she'd received something of his, very late, and wondered if he might want to talk. He replied with an email. And so it began. Letters first, then calls, and finally a plan to meet. They decided on neutral ground, a small inn near Portsmouth, halfway for both of them. She arrived early, waited in the lobby, heart beating in a way she hadn't felt in years. When he walked in, it was like time didn't fold or collapse. It just stepped politely aside. They spent 3 days together. They talked about books, about grief, about all the lives they'd lived between then and now. They laughed at the way they still finished each other's thoughts. They confessed small regrets and left the bigger ones unsaid. They didn't touch, not really. But something old and familiar began to flicker again. A comfort. A sense of recognition. On the last night, they watched a storm move in from the window of the inn's restaurant. He told her he was thinking of selling his house. She told him she wasn't sure she could leave Vermont. There was no decision made, but the air between them buzzed with something unfinished. Something open. When she returned home, there was a letter waiting. His handwriting. Her name. But not what she expected. He wrote that he had loved her. That hadn't changed. But there was something he hadn't told her in person, He hadn't written that letter in 1980. He had written it 6 months ago. He'd found her online, learned of her address, written the letter with old stationery and mailed it to the wrong house on purpose, knowing the delay would add weight, knowing it would feel like fate. He said he had needed her to believe it had always been real. She read the letter twice, then put it back in the envelope. She never replied. For days, she wasn't sure what she felt. There was disappointment, yes, but it wasn't just about the lie. It was about the manipulation of memory. The idea that someone could recreate the past to manufacture a present, that he had used her own longing against her. She wasn't angry. She was simply done. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer beside the stove. She never told anyone about it. Not her friends, not the woman at the bookstore who asked weeks later if she'd been away. Life returned to its quiet rhythm, with the only difference being that sometimes, when she passed the lake, she paused just a little longer than before. Some might say it was a missed opportunity, others that it was a close call. Ellen never gave it a name, but from that day on, she checked her mailbox a little less often, and when spring came, she painted the shutters at last. Thank you for listening. Until the next heartbeat in a story. Subscribe and stay for more love in every word.